A quiet spring evening settled over the apartment complex, soft light that makes sidewalks glow and turns the chatter of children into a gentle hum. A little girl rolled her tricycle into the yard, wheels creaking, cheeks flushed from the warm air. Her mother watched from the window, counting the minutes until they'd head to McDonald's, a small reward after her shift of folding flyers into magazines. She turned away to grab the bundles, a task that would take no more than a few minutes. When she stepped back outside, the sound that had anchored the evening, that small creak of plastic wheels and pedals, was gone. Welcome to Fractured Files, where ordinary moments break, and the truth has to be coaxed out of silence. Tonight follows a 4-year-old who took her tricycle into a yard she knew by heart, a mother who looked up and found the space empty, and a search that twisted through 2 long years before the truth surfaced in a place no one expected. This is the story of Kaylee Ann Poulton and what happened across a handful of minutes in 1994. Kaylee Ann Poulton was born on September 20th, 1989, in Rochester, New York. She was an only child, bright and outgoing, the center of 2 parents who loved her. When she turned 3, her parents divorced, and Kaylee stayed with her mother, Judy. The separation didn't erase her father. He visited often, and the adults kept the peace well enough that Kaylee's small world felt mostly steady. Judy moved to an apartment complex in a quiet suburban pocket of the city. A fence bordered the complex from a nearby highway. Kids clustered in the shared yard after school, and with that, many small bikes, scooters, and voices, the space had its own rhythm. Money was tighter than Judy wanted to admit. She picked up a part-time job delivering magazines around the neighborhood, stuffing promotional leaflets inside each copy before she headed out. It was a bridge to something she'd promised herself and her daughter, a trip to Disney World the following summer. In May of 1994, that plan was close enough to touch. On the evening of the 23rd, Judy sat at the table sliding leaflets into magazines. Around 6:45 p.m., Kaylee asked to go out. The air was warm, the yard was busy, and the tricycle by the door might as well have been vibrating with impatience. Judy checked the view from the window, saw clusters of children in sight, and said yes. Stay in the yard. Be back in a few minutes. A small boundary in a familiar space. The minutes slipped by. Judy gathered the stacked magazines, walked them to the car, and started to call Kaylee back inside. No answer. The yard felt the same at first glance, but the shape of it had shifted. No small figure, no red tricycle. That was the first shiver of wrongness. Judy called again. She checked the corners of the building and the line of trees. Nothing. The tricycle, which usually announced itself with a distinctive creak, didn't turn up on the walkway either. Panic escalated fast, the way it does when a parent's eyes don't land on the one face they need to see. Her calls pulled neighbors to windows and doorways. Some stepped out right away. The initial search fanned across the complex, into the yards, under porches, down the fence line that separated the apartments from the highway. Kaylee hadn't been allowed to roam beyond that yard, and she didn't test rules. She was 4. The tricycle was small. If she had simply wandered, a neighbor would have pointed. Nothing like that happened. The quiet stretched into something sharper, and Judy called 911. Police arrived within minutes. Firefighters and K-9 units followed. Officers split into teams and started from the ground they knew was most promising. Inside the complex, they went door to door. Residents opened up without hesitation, some ushering officers in as if the faster they moved, the sooner fear would stop. In units where no one answered, the complex manager used spare keys to let the police in. The search was specific to a missing child. The law allowed them to check spaces where a child could be hidden or trapped. Closets, bathrooms, underbeds, inside cabinets that could physically hold a body. Officers didn't and couldn't tear apart every drawer or slice open furniture. Hours passed. No Kaylee, no tricycle. The fence and trees were checked. The boundary line toward the highway was walked and re-walked. By 4 a.m., the case was reclassified as a kidnapping. A special unit took the lead. Detectives asked Judy to rewind her world in words. Was there anyone in their lives who held a grudge? Anyone who had spoken oddly about Kaylee? Anyone who stood out in recent weeks? The questions were standard. They were also blunt enough to hurt. Judy told them about a new resident, a 22-year-old named Mark, who had moved in with his wife and 1.5-year-old son. She'd met him in the yard more than once. His comments had walked past friendly. He had said Kaylee was very beautiful. Parents hear that often, and the words by themselves don't always catch on the way down. The tone had made her skin prickle. He'd added something worse. He said he'd been watching all the little girls in the complex, and that Kaylee was the prettiest. After that, she avoided him. She still saw him near the swings sometimes. Once, he asked if Kaylee would tell her if someone tried to touch her. Judy said yes and left immediately, an exit that moves a boundary from drawn to enforced. Before those conversations, Kaylee liked to play with Mark's son on the playground. Afterward, Judy wouldn't allow it, even if she stood right there. When the detectives asked about the first minutes of the search, Judy remembered another detail. A few minutes after she realized Kaylee was missing, she saw Mark in the yard. He came out with his son and headed toward the playground. When she asked if he'd seen Kaylee, he said no. She also noticed his sneakers. The laces were missing. Panic dulls and sharpens in odd ways. The strangeness registered but didn't hold her attention. She had her daughter to find. Police brought Mark in for questioning. He denied involvement and agreed to a polygraph. The operator marked no deceptive answers, and with that, the pressure on him slipped. The apartment he shared with his wife had already been searched that first night. No bicycle, no child. Judy, without intending to, reinforced his alibi by placing him in the yard with his son when she was looking for Kaylee. With the immediate ground producing nothing, detectives turned back toward the person whose proximity and love made her both a victim and suspect in many cases. They asked Judy the same questions in different ways. She answered all of them, again and again, understanding that this was procedure and also feeling the sting of time spent anywhere but on the man she had flagged. Kaylee's face went to the public quickly. Local news carried the story. Flyers went up across the city, billboards lit with her photo and the words that usually follow these cases: missing, 4 years old, last seen wearing, please call. The phones began to ring, tips stacked up past 1,000. Officers checked them and the rhythm became familiar. Call, write, drive, knock, take notes, return to the complex with nothing that felt like a key. Months went by, harsh and unforgiving. Judy didn't step back, she stepped in deeper. She left her job and made the search her work. She printed flyers and refreshed them when weather peeled ink from staple holes. She called newsrooms and reminded producers that a 4-year-old hadn't come home. Volunteers showed up who had no debt to pay and no history with the family beyond empathy. They carried stacks of handbills into stores and offices, and they helped raise $100,000 for a reward. The case reached national shows. The Oprah Winfrey Show featured Kaylee, and a well-known program about unsolved crimes aired her story twice. Judy persuaded local companies to keep flyers in lobbies and on delivery trucks. 2 airlines agreed to tuck them into ticket envelopes. The coverage mattered. The leads kept coming. None pointed where they needed to go. 2 years passed. On August 9th, 1996, the phone at the police department rang with a call that shifted the weight of the case in a single sentence. A woman said she had argued with her husband and wanted a divorce. He had been acting strange for a couple years now. He had tried to talk her out of it, begged for sympathy, and then, as if the confession might move her, told her he had killed the little girl from the complex. He had killed Kaylee. The name she gave the world was already on the case file, Mark Christie. Detectives understood at once they had a legal problem. In that state, statements made between spouses were privileged. The conversation she had with her husband couldn't be used in court. They couldn't arrest him on the strength of it. They couldn't even force him into an interview. The reality of the early hours came back all at once. The fast search of his apartment when officers had limited authority to look for anything but a child, Judy's memory of him in the yard with his son, the way the needle on the polygraph had stayed quiet. The case had tilted toward him on instinct before. Now it tilted harder without gaining the leverage to act. Detective Crow took the call. He decided to go anyway. He learned that Mark had moved out of the complex weeks after Kaylee vanished, a move that followed complaints from parents about an incident that spiraled from creepy to alarming. They had reported that he stood naked in his doorway where others could see him. No charges stuck. He was inside his home. The fact sharpened the picture of his behavior without giving the law anything to hold. Mark had relocated to a town 50 miles from Rochester. Crow drove there and knocked. Mark's mother opened the door. She said her son wouldn't talk without a lawyer. They'd already called one. It felt like the window had slammed shut. Crow didn't leave. He waited. Mark came out. The detective suggested they go somewhere public and talk. Nothing formal, just a conversation. A nearby Italian restaurant would do. Mark agreed, but only if Crow would drive him to his lawyer afterward. It wasn't the kind of concession detectives rely on, but it was enough to slide a chair back from a table and to order coffee. Crow made a choice. He kept the conversation soft, almost casual. It wasn't a trick. It was a calculation about pressure and how quickly it snaps the thread you need someone to pick up and carry. He already knew Mark. They'd spoken in the early days after Kaylee vanished. Crow believed there was pride tucked inside Mark's fear, the sort of pride that shows up when a person sees themselves as smarter than the people trying to catch him. Crow leaned into that. He told Mark that if he had done this, he had fooled a full team of investigators for 2 years, that it was something most people couldn't manage. Mark took the bait. He said he didn't want to sound proud, but the way he got rid of the bicycle had been ingenious. Did the detective want to hear? Mark warned that he would only talk about the bike, nothing else. Crow didn't push. He didn't need to. Mark talked anyway. He said the tricycle had been inside his apartment for 3 days after Kaylee disappeared. He knew police would search every unit without a warrant because a child was missing, but he also knew the practical limit. They could only look in places large enough to fit a child. He cut the tricycle into pieces and hid them in spots too small to hold a body. Some parts he wrapped in clothes and tucked into closets. Some he put into small bags and ferried to his car. Officers at the complex exit stopped vehicles and looked for a child. They didn't open bags that couldn't have concealed one. He disposed of the parts gradually, far from home. Crow realized he was standing at the edge of a confession that mattered. He told Mark that maybe what happened hadn't been intentional, that perhaps it had been an accident and that he'd panicked. Mark asked about prison time. Crow said he could be looking at about 25 years. Mark complained that it would be unfair to spend half his life behind bars, away from his wife and son, that the last 2 years had been their own kind of punishment. Crow ignored the complaint and told him that if he wanted relief, he needed to tell the truth. Mark said he would confess, but only after he spoke with a lawyer. Crow leveled with him. No lawyer would let him confess with no evidence on the table. If he waited, Kaylee's parents would never know what had happened to their daughter. They would never know whether she had suffered. Mark said she didn't suffer. The door opened. Crow told him it was time to do the right thing for himself, for his family, and for God. Mark looked at him and admitted it. He said he strangled Kaylee. He said he did nothing else to her. He started at the beginning. He claimed that Kaylee had come to his apartment to play with his toddler son, and he let her in. He took the tricycle to the kitchen. He knew Judy wouldn't allow it, so he didn't want to draw attention. Kaylee went upstairs to the children's room. About 10 minutes later, he heard Judy in the yard calling her daughter's name. He panicked. He said he was afraid of her anger for letting the girl into the apartment without permission. He walked upstairs and strangled Kaylee with his hands. Crow listened and kept his doubts to himself. The story flattened motive in a way that felt self-protective. It seemed far more likely that Mark had lured Kaylee in because his wife was at work, that he had tried to molest her, and that hearing Judy call for her daughter had triggered a fear of being exposed. Judy's memory of Mark's sneakers without laces also hovered over the table. It suggested that he had time to plan. Crow didn't argue any of that. He needed the rest. Mark said that after killing Kaylee, he carried her to the kitchen and left her on the floor. He took his son outside to manufacture an alibi. He made sure Judy saw him in the playground and then returned to the apartment when she moved away to continue searching. He placed Kaylee's body in a laundry basket and covered it with clothes. Then he walked the basket to his car. By then, the yard was crowded. People were focused on Judy and the fence line. No one watched him slide the basket into his trunk. He took his son with him and drove to his workplace, a facility where he worked as a security guard. He parked near the back of the building and set the basket by the door, then drove around and walked through the main entrance, telling co-workers he'd forgotten something inside. No one blinked. He opened the back door from the inside, retrieved the basket, and climbed a ladder to the top of a massive 30,000-gallon tank filled with liquid coolant. He opened the lid and dropped Kaylee's body into the tank. He said he tied a heavy metal object to her. He said he threw away her clothing afterward, but that he'd left her earrings in place. He went home and joined the neighbors who were searching the complex. He had moved the body out of the apartment grounds before the first police cruiser parked at the curb. Mark finished the story and called it a terrible mistake. Crow paid for the meal. Then he got in the detective's car and rode to the station, where he was arrested and charged with murder. His lawyer tried to pull the confession out of the record. The attempt failed. Mark had spoken freely. Crow had violated no law. Officers went to the plant and opened the tank. 2 years had passed. The recovery didn't give medical examiners enough to determine cause of death or confirm the details that mattered most to the family. But they could identify her. Judy buried her child. In court, Mark pleaded guilty. He received a minimum of 25 years in prison. The state dropped kidnapping in a deal negotiated by his attorney. Another quiet insult layered onto the harm already done. The story of that night could have ended there. It didn't. In 2010, an old case was reopened. In 1988, a 74-year-old woman named Viola Manville had been murdered while taking a walk in a Rochester suburb. Back then, detectives had looked at several suspects, including a 16-year-old named Mark. He had taken a polygraph and passed. The investigation shifted. Police arrested a man named Frank Sterling. He denied guilt, then confessed after an overnight interrogation that left him exhausted and disoriented. He tried to appeal from prison, arguing that the confession had been coerced. He lost. He stayed inside for 19 years. When the case reopened, evidence went back to the lab. A DNA profile emerged from the scene. It didn't match Sterling. It matched an inmate whose profile sat in the federal database, Mark Christie. In 2011, at 39, Mark confessed to Viola's murder. He received an additional 28 years. He said nothing about motive and showed no remorse. Sterling walked out of prison after almost 2 decades. He sued and received a settlement of nearly $10 million in 2014. 3 years later, he died of a heart attack at 54. Mark remained in prison. Parole eligibility crept onto calendars. Release was not promised. What was certain, and what hurt to say out loud, was this: if investigators in 1988 hadn't fixed on the wrong suspect, if they hadn't pulled a confession from a man who insisted later he could barely stand up by the end of the questioning, Mark might have been removed from the world earlier. Kaylee might have ridden her tricycle back to the steps that night and gone to McDonald's with her mother. The line from one case to the other is painful to trace, but it's a line that matters. When people talk about a child vanishing from a yard, they often picture open gates and strangers in cars. The truth here is smaller and more frightening. A neighbor with a toddler. Kaylee was 4. She had plastic wheels that squeaked when she moved and a summer trip in her mother's mind. Her mother carried the search into offices and airports and onto television until her face haunted a killer and pressed him into speaking. There's no justice that returns what was taken, but there is truth, and there is the work that makes sure the silence doesn't get to keep the last word. This is Fractured Files. If this story mattered to you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it so more people hear these cases told with patience and care. New investigations are on the way. Stay safe and stay watchful.